Welcome to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. On this podcast, we'll be discussing nonviolent readings of Latter-day Saint Scripture. I'm Dan, and I'm joined by my wife and co-host, Marianne.
The Latter-day Peace Studies project is born out of a desire to proclaim peace by providing an opportunity to approach religion, Scripture, and relationships with God in a peaceful way. As we develop peace within ourselves first, we can reflect peace into the world around us. The Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me podcast seeks to assist listeners in their approach to Scripture by providing nonviolent interpretation. Our hope is that we can integrate the teachings of the Scriptures into our efforts to find peace within ourselves and proclaim peace in the world.
Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies. We are finishing out the book of Alma. We're finishing out the war chapters. We're about to go into Helaman. There's still a lot of ground to cover, but we're like 2/3 of the way through at the end of this week. So it's quite impressive if you ask me. These chapters are hard. I mean, there's lots of like themes that you can draw out. There's lots of little bits and pieces that are really good, but we're also dealing with massive reworking of time and space because we've sort of been with Moroni on, I think what we can say is probably the Eastern Front. And now we're going to deal with Helaman a little bit on the Western Front, but we're dealing with things that happened, 5 years ago. I think Helaman's recounting the last 4 years of the war on the Western Front. And then we're going to have continued movement of people and armies, like the Lamanite armies and all the places that they go and show up, groups of prisoners. I mean, there's so much movement in time and space in these chapters that if you thought like the Messiah, splitting from Zarahemla and then everything that happened back in Lehi Nephi was kind of complex, just go map this out in your head. Like, try and figure out what was happening at the same time. It's tough. Okay, one of the first things that I noticed in chapter 53, verse 7, Moroni, he did employ his men in preparing for war. So prior to this, when we're talking about Moroni's attitude towards war and how he's preparing his people, he is always described as preparing the hearts of the people to be faithful to God. So does this represent a total change? I mean, I don't know that we can say that for sure, but it seems like there might be like a psychological change to Moroni. The war has dragged on for a while at this point, and Nephite successes have been matched by Lamanite successes. And in fact, Lamanite successes that won't be turned back for, I think, a few more years. We get to like the 29th year of the Judges, and then I think it doesn't end until the 35th year of the Judges. Yeah, so we've got a few years to cover. I don't know, do you have any general thoughts or insights as we begin this?
Just that he mentions several times, and he, I think meaning Mormon, because most of the times when it's mentioned, it is third person. So that Mormon covers, multiple times he mentions that the intrigue amongst the Nephites, which causes dissensions among them, he reiterates, and thus because of iniquity amongst themselves, they were placed in the most dangerous circumstances. And so I think that he is trying to draw our attention to the Nephites' role in this predicament that they're in, and that this isn't people who were just, everything was going great and they were just doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and then these people they had some culpability in this conflict, in the direction that it goes, not just in like the Nephites or the Lamanites coming against them, but how they're able to respond to that situation is hampered by how they've responded to sort of internal affairs.
Yeah. And
there are many times in these 11 chapters that we're covering this week that Mormon kind of calls our attention back to that and reminds us that like, this is why this is more difficult. This is why the war is dragging on, and that this is the Nephites' own failure to really address their problems.
Is it in these chapters that we get the famous, and the war caused some people to be more faithful and some people to lose some? I don't remember what verse that is off the top of my head, but
it's
that's
toward
one that
the
always,
end. But yeah.
Yeah, that always sticks out to me because, that's kind of the theme. Is like, war might be justified, as we've talked about, but even if it's justified, our response to war is actually kind of the more important part, and not necessarily going fighting, but the effects of all these things. We're now at, this is the biggest conflict they're going to have with the Lamanites. And again, just to emphasize, it's stirred up by Nephite dissenters. Now, I find it interesting, jumping way ahead, when Teancum goes to kill Amaron, we get this contrast between what Teancum sees. He says he's exceedingly angry with Amaron. He considered Amaron and Amalickiah the cause of the great and lasting war between them and the Lamanites. Teancum blames this war on the two Lamanite kings. But back in Alma 60...
Well, who had been Nephites.
Right. But
right.
I mean, they're still Lamanite kings. But
yes.
Right. But back in Alma 60, Moroni identified the kingmen as the primary cause of Nephite losses. So I'm not saying that those are necessarily, one is like, oh, this is the cause, and the cause generally, and this is the cause specifically. But either way, they're both Nephite dissenters, both groups of Nephite dissenters. But it's interesting that Teancum is a little more specific in his rage. Moroni's anger is one thing that definitely sticks out again.
Well, Amalickiah, back when we're introduced to him in the story, and this is last week, Amalickiah is the leader of the kingmen, and he leads the movement to try to change their laws to have him appointed as king. And when they lose, he raises a ruckus and is driven out of Zarahemla.
Yes, but that was the first group of kingmen, right?
Yes.
By Alma 60, we have a different group of kingmen.
Well, maybe it's just that same strain continued.
I think that's really likely.
Yeah.
But Moroni is, exceedingly sorrowful because actually I think he just described the wickedness of his people, not even the kingmen specifically, but just the wickedness of the people generally.
Another kind of larger theme I noticed through these chapters, especially as I was reading them close together instead of as spread out as I usually would, is noting what each of the armies do with their prisoners. Prisoners of war are a really big deal in this war. They're capturing a lot of prisoners. They don't know quite what to do with them, how to keep them occupied and fed while still trying to save their things for their people. And then that the Lamanites have also taken many prisoners of war, but a lot of them are women and children. How they decide to do prisoner exchanges, and just that is a constant theme running through here. How they take prisoners and how they treat them and what they do with them, and then how that resolves. So for the prisoners of war, for the Nephites, it seems like they never actually get to an exchange, because every time an exchange is suggested, they find another solution, more or less. So Moroni suggests a prisoner swap with Amaron, or is Amaron the one that suggests it first?
I think Moroni writes to Amaron and says,
so
hey,
Amaron sent unto Moroni, chapter 54, verse 1. Amaron sent unto Moroni, desiring that he would exchange prisoners. And so Moroni is excited about that, but he knows that they have a lot more women and children in their prisoner camps than the Nephites have of Lamanites. They mostly just have fighting men. And so Moroni wants to exchange a man and his wife and children for one of the Lamanite men. And Amaron rejects that. Well, he doesn't reject it, actually. He says, fine, like we can exchange, but they have a war of words in their letter. Neither one has very nice things to say about the other. And then Moroni rejects the prisoner swap. And he goes, never mind. We don't want to exchange prisoners. We'll just come get them ourselves. And so that's what they do. The way that
Amaron writes is so provocative. And then he's like, but yeah, we'll do the prisoners swap thing. And then he, is like, he's so belligerent. I can imagine Moroni's response, like, that's how I would have probably responded, right? Like, well, now I'm not going to do it, right? If you're going to be this way.
Yeah, Moroni definitely matches his energy. He writes back to him in chapter 55. It says, Moroni was more angry because he knew that Amaron had a perfect knowledge of his fraud. Yea, he knew that Amaron knew that it was not a just cause that had caused him to wage a war against the people of Nephi. And he said, behold, I will not exchange prisoners with Amaron, save he will withdraw his purpose, as I have stated in my epistle, for I will not grant unto him that he shall have any more power than what he hath got. So he says, unless he just gives up and goes home, I'm not going to exchange prisoners, which is consistent with what he has done ever since Zarahemna invaded their land. And he said, except if you tell me you're not going to fight anymore, you can go home in peace. But if you won't take that covenant, that vow, I'm not going to accept your surrender. So they get their prisoners back. They find out where they're being held, and they go use a strategy to break them out.
The other thing there's one more thing in Amaron's remarks that kind of intrigued me, because we get a little bit of an insight into his psychology, because he says, "For behold, your fathers did wrong their brethren, insomuch that they did rob them of their right to the government when it rightly belonged to them." Well, Amaron has already declared himself a Zoramite. So what does he really care? Does he really view himself as like restoring this ancient bloodline justice? I I thought that was kind of funny that he's got that idea. Well, this is an ancient thing that I'm just going to restore the just position of the older brother.
Well, what's interesting about that is that you could argue, I think, that he, like his brother Amalickiah, is a great politician, persuader, probably charming, has no problem getting people to follow him. And so you could say that this argument is sort of the argument he uses on his people, but isn't exactly like a deeply held belief of his. It's just sort of what he found as the justification that really pushed people's buttons. That might have been the argument. We were talking about this last week. What sorts of arguments the Nephite dissenters used among the Lamanites to stir them up to anger. Mm-hmm. And this sounds like this is probably one of them. So yeah, it probably is the sort of thing that he said over and over again until maybe he started to believe it, or maybe he really did believe it. But Moroni is convinced that he knows of his own fraud, that he is perfectly aware of how unjust this war is. I love in chapter 55, when they go to get these prisoners, they go get the guards. They find the city where they're being held, and they get the guards drunk with wine they get one of the former guards of the king that Amalickiah murdered. Mm-hmm. One of his former guards is among Moroni's armies, which I also find interesting because they went to go live with the people of Ammon. So one or more of them joined the military campaign. But he goes over and pretends to be, I'm a Lamanite. You can trust me. We escaped and we got this extra wine, but let's save it. And of course, when you tell people that you're going to save something, they want it immediately. And so they get the guards drunk, basically, and then they get they pass the weapons over the wall inside the city, and they arm everyone, all the prisoners inside the city. And all these things were done in a profound silence, which I think is a really interesting note. But I think these verses right here are another testament to Moroni's character, for him to take precautions that he does not have to take to prevent the loss of more life. That's not necessary. So in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 55, "But had they awakened the Lamanites, behold, they were drunken, and the Nephites could have slain them. But behold, this was not the desire of Moroni. He did not delight in murder or bloodshed, but he delighted in the saving of his people from destruction. And for this cause he might not bring upon him injustice. He would not fall upon the Lamanites and destroy them in their drunkenness." He doesn't even want to slay the guards. He just wants to incapacitate them for a while so they can get their people out. So that again speaks, even after the hardening of war, of his commitment to preserve life whenever possible.
This trick with the wine also kind of reminds me back to like Limhi and his people, and the fact that, King Noah was a wine bibber. So That's sort of like the bad guy is getting drunk. Has kind of this long history of being in the Nephite subconscious.
Well, it's interesting because it's not like none of them ever partake of wine in their, but the overconsumption is what always seems to be the problem there. So
exactly. This also is Moroni fulfilling his promises, because he's arming the women and children, which is what he said he would do in that letter. We get to the end of that chapter and we get Moroni making preparations for Morianton, but we kind of interrupt that, right? Because that's when he gets this letter from Helaman. That's the end of the 20 and 9th year. And so now we're going to do like a little bit of a flashback, finding out what Helaman's been up to over on the western/southern front. I mean, I don't know the exact orientation of all this. If you kind of map it out, relatively, it really seems like Zarahemla is right in the dead center, and then everything else is happening all around it in like a pincher. And then you've got the land of the north. And so Zarahemla must have been it had to be set off from everything by some sort of topography, I imagine.
Hmm.
It's my only explanation for why Zarahemla seems to be like unassailable.
Very much in the center. So yeah, Helaman writes this letter to Moroni, and the actual distance doesn't seem to be that great, but it's great enough that he writes about stuff that happened 4 years ago. So it's
Yeah.
like, how did Moroni not know about some of these things that have been happening for the last 4 years? Or maybe he assumed that Moroni does know about them, but he's just sort of giving his accounting of it. But Helaman mentions 3 times in these introductory verses about the covenant which the people of Ammon had made, that he didn't want them to break that covenant. And he says, so I would not suffer them that they should break this covenant which they had made, supposing that God would strengthen us insomuch that we should not suffer any more because of the fulfilling the oath which they had taken. So to me, Helaman is kind of demonstrating here that he does see another way. He's seeing that third option as far as not submitting their lives, but also not encouraging them to take up arms against their enemies anymore. And so he says, I don't know exactly how, but they're keeping their covenant. And so God's going to bless them for it. And I don't know how he's going to do that, but I'm acting as if I'm acting in faith that whatever happens is God's going to make up the difference there. I really loved that verse and that reminder of Helaman's faith of trusting in God to provide another way.
It also connects to some of the things, I believe it's Behorin who later says, and I don't want to like scroll through all of my notes, but Behorin at one point says like, look, we wouldn't fight this war. We would be fine, but we feel like we should fight this war. Something along those lines. I imagine it's in chapter 60 or 61 or something in there. But there's clearly, I think, when we look at the Kingmen, obviously they were popular enough. It's not like they could be making bad points. And the points that they would be making seem kind of obvious. I mean, could you imagine being several years into a war where you've been beaten back several times? The Kingmen, their argument is making itself, especially when we've already had a big group of Lamanites sent to Zarahemla as prisoners. And I think we're going to get a second group who doesn't make it all the way to Zarahemla, but still they were intending to. Mm-hmm. So you imagine Kingmen mourning like, we're going to be stuck in this endless war with the Lamanites, and they're just going to keep sending the prisoners here, so you're going to have to live with a bunch of Lamanite prisoners and all that sort of stuff. So I can really see how Nephite society is not doing great. And so you have these little pockets of hope in the Ammonites, the people of Ammon, and in Gideon, and a handful of other little Nephite outposts. And so I think that that's maybe part of what this is highlighting, is it's like, well, actually, the only reason the Nephites were able to make it through is because of the people who were the most peaceful. If they didn't exist, then their sons wouldn't be able to go to war. So it clearly shows that, their pacifism is not such that it's extending to those who weren't making this covenant, but their pacifism is powerful enough to save the Nephite society.
Well, and in that sense, we could even call it less pacifism because they are actively contributing to the war effort.
Yeah.
And more maybe conscientious objector, but maybe more of like a hyperactive nonviolence. They are actively engaged in trying to help this war be ended. They're just doing it by a nonviolent means.
And when we have a group of Lamanites who is sent to them, we have that. And they're fully willing to accept this group of Lamanites, not as prisoners of war, but more Lamanites to join, again, more Lamanites. Yeah. So the Nephite dissenters are always stirring up the Lamanites to go to war with the Nephites. And the Lamanite dissenters are the ones who are living the most righteous examples for the Nephites.
That's pretty great. Okay, so we also have a very favorite scripture story embedded in these chapters. So we couldn't really cover them without going over the 2,000 stripling warriors. Before we begin their story, though, I want to clarify that the word stripling, we don't use it very much at all anymore. And sometimes I think in our modern minds, it kind of overlaps with the word like strapping. And so we think of them as being big and muscular and very strong for being young men or that kind of thing. But that's actually not what stripling meant. In the 1828 Webster Dictionary, stripling actually comes from strip or stripe, which think of something like long and narrow. So, you know, those like teenage boys who get height before they get their muscles, they just shoot up really fast, but they're all arms and legs. And the definition from the 1828 Webster's is a youth in the state of adolescence or just passing from boyhood to manhood. So that would kind of depend culturally on where, you know, they considered manhood to be. But Helaman emphasizes that they were all of them very young, and he calls them his little sons. I think they are much younger and more innocent, perhaps, than we sometimes see them portrayed. I think deacon or teacher age would probably be more accurate than priest or missionary age.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because after we have, you know, the initial 2000, there's another group of like 60 who join them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you ask yourself, like, how old are these kids? Well, they do have to be old enough to fight.
Right. Be able to hold up strength enough to hold those swords or scimitars or bows or whatever it is that they use. But some of the things that we learn about this group is that when they hear about their parents, their fathers, presumably, thinking about breaking their covenant to go to war, they are being persuaded just by what they're observing, not by anyone around them, that it might be time for them to get involved in this. And Helaman is trying to persuade them not to break that covenant because he believes that that is very serious. But it's very difficult for them to, they says they were moved with compassion and were desirous to take up arms in the defense of their country. But Helaman persuades them not to. But behold, it came to pass they had many sons who had not entered into a covenant. And so also they were probably not just younger when they made the covenant, but also young or not born yet when their parents or their fathers were involved in bloody conflict. And so their whole lives they have known have been peaceful. And so this is that generational passing down. They weren't carrying that forward with them, if that makes sense. They weren't carrying on this generational trauma, you could say, or tradition of violence. They were already creating something new. And they had not entered into a covenant that they would not take their weapons of war to defend themselves against their enemies. Therefore, they did assemble themselves together at this time, and as many as were able to take up arms, and they called themselves Nephites. So they get together and decide that that's what they want to do to help contribute. And then they call themselves Nephites. They change their name because they're taking a new covenant to fight for the liberty of the Nephites, yea, to protect the land unto the laying down of their lives. Yea, even they covenanted that they never would give up their liberty, but they would fight in all cases to protect the Nephites and themselves from bondage. So they enter into a new covenant and take a new name.
Same old pattern. Well, not only that, but then what do they reference? They reference the influence of the feminine on them.
Their mothers.
And so, again, we see that ultimately the Nephite society is saved by Lamanite women.
Yes, many times over, isn't it?
So I don't know how many times that this has been the case, but it happens again and again, right? We've seen. So we start with Ishmael's daughter pleading for Nephi, so woman saving him, and we have a number of times where Nephites would have died were it not for Lamanite women. I mean, even in the sort of awful account of the priests of Noah, that's an instance. Abish, we got there, and now we have these people of Ammon, the women of the people of Ammon.
Yeah.
Their sons are the ones who they trained.
So it says that they were exceedingly valiant for courage and also for strength and activity. But behold, this was not all. They were men who were true at all times, in whatsoever thing they were entrusted. Yea, they were men of truth and soberness, for they had been taught to keep the commandments of God and to walk uprightly before him. And they choose Helaman to be their leader. I mean, he was a man living at this time, but we don't have any evidence that Helaman had military experience. But they chose the most trustworthy person they could think of to be their leader. And I imagine that was very humbling for Helaman.
He was Alma was in the military at one point, so it's possible they had some sort of training, but we don't know which.
Again, it would have made sense for a lot of, for the men of that time to just all be trained in that to a certain extent. So, but we don't have a lot of cultural context. Like, we don't know for sure, but this seems to be his only foray into warfare. And then Helaman says later that he had never seen so great courage, nay, not amongst all the Nephites, as he did among his little band. He calls them his little band of 2,000 stripling warriors. And then he mentions again, all of them were very young, but that they had been taught by their mothers that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. And they rehearsed unto me the words of their mothers, saying, we do not doubt, our mothers knew it. So just that, yeah, the Nephite civilization being saved by Lamanite women, that these are young men, presumably too young to be launched into the world by themselves yet. They would have been coming straight from their homes, that they had received such powerful testimony and instruction in the early years of their lives that they were already prepared with such great courage and faith. And that's really remarkable.
I mean, this whole story is fantastic because what is the result? That they are able to come to the city, to Antipas? Antipara. Yeah, Antipas was the leader.
Is the leader.
Antipara is the city. And so they were able to come, and Antipas is slain, but they are able to join the people of Antipas and surround the Lamanites and win this war. And then none of these stripling warriors are killed. And this is where they have their first group of prisoners of war that they sent to Zarahemla. And so then they march back to Judea. And now we find out that actually Helaman also got an epistle from Ammoron about changing up the prisoners of war. And so first, essentially what Helaman had just done in that tactic, Antipara, is one that Moroni does. But a few years, like I think this was in the beginning of the, what would this be? This is the third day of the 7th month. And I think that this happens. And this is the same year that Moroni does it, but Moroni describes his account as occurring towards the end of the year. Mm-hmm. So Helaman actually did it first.
Yeah.
Then we get this epistle from Ammoron. So not only are they doing the same military maneuvers, they're both in correspondence with Ammoron. Helaman and Moroni are doing very similar things, even though they are apparently not communicating until now.
So yeah, Ammoron offers to give up the city of Antipara in exchange for prisoners. We don't get the exact exchange between them like we do Moroni and Ammoron, but Helaman says that we were sure our forces were sufficient to take the city of Antipara by our force. And by delivering up the prisoners for that city, we should suppose ourselves unwise, and that we would only deliver up our prisoners on exchange. And Ammoron refused mine epistle, for he would not exchange prisoners. So Ammoron is willing to give up the city in exchange for prisoners, but Helaman, this sounds a little bit sarcastic even. I just kind of imagine Helaman having a much more syrupy, maybe over the top, I don't think that would be a very good idea. You see, that would not be to our advantage. Kind of the opposite of Moroni. Moroni is all blustery and blunt force and just straight to the point. Helaman's just like, no thanks. But then in verse 4, it says the people of Antipara did leave the city and fled to their other cities, which they had possession of, or to fortify them. And thus the city of Antipara fell into our hands. That one's just kind of like the people just up and leave. Like they don't have to fight them or anything. They just leave.
It appears that Antipara was probably not, maybe Ammoron knew that Antipara was not the most desirable city. And so he was trying to angle, if he can trade his weakness for a strength, then he's good. I don't want to just go through like all the battles and all these things, but suffice to say that the Nephite, military campaign continues through Helaman. We've got more prisoners going to Zarahemla, but obviously this second group is not as successful because another group of Lamanites is coming to Cumeni. Verse 27 always sticks out to me. Now this was the faith of those whom I have spoken. They are young and their minds are firm, and they do put their trust in God continually. So their success at battle after battle is not any sort of special strength or power. It's their faith.
Their trust in the Lord. And when Helaman is describing this more in his epistle, and he says, we are again delivered out of the hands of our enemies, and blessed is the name of our God, for behold, it is he that has delivered us, yea, that has done this great thing for us. And so he's really trying to not do what some of the Nephites have done in the past and boasting in their own strength, but he's recognizing the Lord's hand and delivering them. And I think we can really see that, like that, the city of Antipara that we just mentioned, they didn't even have to fight for that city. Now, much as it might have been a tactical advantage for Ammoron to have them flee, or any of those, it remains that that was a battle they didn't have to fight, that they're going through some really difficult things, but he recognizes the Lord being with them. He says in this next chapter in 58 that the Lord our God did visit us with assurances that he would deliver us, yea, insomuch that he did speak peace to our souls, and did grant unto us great faith, and did cause us that we should hope for our deliverance in him. And this comes after, just before then, that verse, he says, we did pour out our souls in prayer to God. So they spend a lot of time and effort in these afflictions, turning to the Lord and praying for his assistance, and then feeling that comfort. I think this is a great example of how the Lord comforts us, because he actually doesn't specifically say, oh, don't worry, it's ending soon, or don't worry, I'm sending this to happen, or like, he's not specific, but he calms them and he assures them that he knows what they're going through, and he recognizes their faithfulness to him, and that he's on it, that it's coming.
It reminds me of the people of Alma, that they, when they were under Lamanite rulership, that they were praying and preparing their hearts, and they got the assurance that they would be delivered. Now, this is about to be sort of the most miserable time of the war, because they're essentially they're no longer able to implement any of their sort of Nephite stratagems, right? The Lamanites are now aware of all of these things, and so the Lamanites just sit in their fortified cities, and then every once in a while send out these raiding parties to sort of mess things up. They do get some assistance from the parents of the stripling warriors, right? But they're not getting anything from the government. So he does manage one more of these little tricks with the hampered army, should we say, like on their last legs, unreinforced, unprovisioned. They're able to get one more bit of trickeration against the city of Manti, that they are able to take Manti. But that actually winds up being sort of I don't want to say Pyrrhic victory, but that comes with a major caveat, because the group of Lamanites that they drive out of the city of Manti winds up joining the assault on Nephihah. So, and Nephihah is one of the worst battles, and it's, just an absolute pain. So, unbeknownst to Helaman at this point, he's actually going to cause Moroni some problems with this action. Verse 37, I think, behold, it matters not. We trust God will deliver us, notwithstanding the weakness of our armies, yea, and deliver us out of the hands of the enemies. That is the ultimate faith that they have, is that God is going to deliver them. And so far they have.
After Moroni hears this recounting from Helaman, he knows that something is wrong in Zarahemla. Again, it kind of baffles me that he doesn't have a better grasp of what's going on all fronts, but I'm sure there are explanations for it. But it's hard to imagine that over the course of years, they didn't have instant communication. That's not what I mean. But even over the course of years, before the technology of the telegraph, really, the fastest way that information could travel was on horseback. No information traveled faster than a horse. And so if we assume that to be the maximum speed, that still wouldn't take 4 years to cover. So I don't know exactly how this communication.
I mean, Helaman was busy. That's all I can explain. I mean, it's also possible that maybe some of his former communications have been intercepted. I don't know. There's lots of potential reasons, but we have no evidence in the text for why that is.
So then we have Moroni writing his very famous epistle to the chief judge, Pahoran, and he makes some very strong, maybe accusations isn't right, because he doesn't assume that Pahoran is guilty, but he does not exempt Pahoran from his anger. He doesn't know if Pahoran is involved in this withholding of support or not. So he doesn't assume one way or the other, but he does not mince words with, if he says, if you are a part of this, I'm going to make sure you pay.
Well, given that he said earlier, we have this narrative where he says, oh, and this put down the kingman. It kind of makes you say, well, is he just a little bit in denial about that? Is he just searching for like a scapegoat here? Pahoran is sort of the one that makes the most sense, because Pahoran's kind of the most responsible since he is chief judge. So Moroni his anger is understandable and the direction is reasonable. It's just a little bit off.
And again, Moroni emphasizes here in verse 15 of chapter 60, for were it not for the wickedness which first commenced at our head, we could have withstood our enemies, that they could have gained no power over us. So this is another note of this is wickedness among the Nephites that has made all of this much more difficult.
Yeah.
And he tells Pahoran that Pahoran has been placed in a situation of responsibility and duty, and that he is not fulfilling that duty, and that if that is not his own fault, he will come help him. But if it is his own fault, he's going to make him pay. And I love in verse 20 where he says, have ye forgotten the commandments of the Lord your God? Yea, have ye forgotten the captivity of our fathers? Have ye forgotten the many times we have been delivered out of the hands of our enemies? Sounds like Alma 5.
Yeah, I actually wrote Moroni taking a page from Alma's playbook.
Yeah, which I mean is what Nephi says to his brothers many times over, reminding them of their father's captivity in Egypt. And so just the reminder of what the Lord has already done for them. And Moroni also sets this up, especially with Pahoran, to say the Lord has already delivered us, but if you think that he's going to deliver us if we do nothing, you don't understand how this works. And I think that this is a good demonstration of sort of the difference between pacifism and nonviolence. Nonviolence does not suggest that in the face of violence, we do nothing. Nonviolence suggests that we find another way, that we confront evil with compassion, with greater love, that we seek out. It is proactive. We seek out things to do to confront that evil without resorting to violence. I just thought that was a good illustration of how different that is from just sitting back and expecting that we don't have to do anything. It is not laziness. It is the exact opposite. It is intellectual and moral and physical activity.
Yeah, it requires creativity, imagination, imagination, which is hope. We've talked about sort of that context, the ability to construct the future, and then of course remembering the captivity. That's remembering the deliverance of God. That's faith, because it's constructing the past. Moroni has some great lines in all of these chapters. I seek not for power, but to pull it down is obviously one of the all-time greats. Mm. He gets the response back from Pahoran, and you got to hand it to Pahoran. Of all the ways that he could have responded, this is so tactful.
Masterful, truly. Yeah.
Yeah, masterful. Kind of does make you wonder why he hadn't sent a message to Moroni earlier. But again, perhaps communication is tough in the Nephite lands when they're really busy fighting all these wars. So this is just the first time that they've been able to get them. We find out that people had been seeking a king again, and just reminds me of the Amalanites who are ruling over the people of Alma, because they want a king, or no, they have appointed a king, and they wrote to the Lamanites, and they want to join an alliance with the Lamanites so that they can sort of be this vassal king. So we've seen that that's kind of how the Lamanites operate. They have one general king and then several minor kings.
Well, and Pahoran tells Moroni that he's not even in Zarahemla right now. It's not even safe for him to be there. He and a few other people in the government had to flee to somewhere else. And where do they go? They go to the land of Gideon that you pointed out in pre-show discussion. And what do we know about the people in Gideon? Well, 30 years ago or so, Alma went and preached this great sermon about the coming of Christ and the atonement of Christ. And Gideon was a pretty righteous city, and they didn't let Korihor preach in their city. So Gideon seems to be a great place of refuge for the followers of Christ.
One of my favorite, this was a verse I referenced earlier, verse 12 in here. We would subject ourselves to the yoke of bondage if it were requisite with the justice of God, or if he should command us so to do. They do recognize there is still a way to be peaceful here, but obviously they are not getting that position. And because we have this sort of established law of war, they've been attacked more than 3 times. They are fully justified. And so I think they have this no, actually we won't. Based off what we know, what's been given to us, we're going to act in the way that makes sense for us.
They are saying that he doth not command us that we shall subject ourselves to our enemies, but that we should put our trust in him and he will deliver us. They are, I think, trying to put into action that the adage of pray like everything depends on God and then work like everything depends on you. Much as you may or may not ascribe to that theology, That does seem to be the faithful interpretation that they have of the commandments that they've been given and how they understand things. They are making a true-hearted effort to do what they believe the right thing is. And the Lord blesses them for that. And he does say in verse a little later in the chapter, in verse 19, he says, I do joy in receiving your epistle, for I was somewhat worried concerning what we should do, whether it should be just in us to go against our brethren. So I think that's why he hadn't contacted Moroni yet, is because he wasn't sure about what he should do if this is essentially going to war against his own people. This is a civil war, and that's a big deal, and he's considering it very carefully, as he should. But when he gets another person's perspective on it, it really helps him to sharpen his thoughts and figure out what the right thing to do is.
Getting towards the end, we get to the final battle scenes because Moroni goes back, stirs up all of these people to come to Zarahemla. Moroni and Pahoran to go down into Zarahemla and go to the city. They meet Pachus and his men, and they got to be a short battle. Pachus was slain, and men were taken prisoners, and we get things restituted, right? Verse 9, we've got some of these kingmen who have been in prison for 5 years now. And so Mormon is treating the men of Pachus and the kingmen as two distinct groups in this sort of retelling, but it's not to say that they aren't the same ideology. So after this all happens, this is now they can return. We get them headed to Nephihah, right? This is where a lot of the things are coming to a head. And they run into, is this where they run into the Lamanites?
Yes. So on their way here in verse 15, so Moroni and Pahoran are together heading toward Nephihah with more provisions and more men to help in that quarter of the land. And in verse 15, and it came to pass that as they were marching towards the land, they took a large body of men of the Lamanites and slew many of them. So they come across this other regiment or body of soldiers of the Lamanites that is not in a city and presumably is like going to help them or something. And they slew many of them and took their provisions and their weapons of war. And it came to pass, after they had taken them, they caused them to enter into a covenant that they would no more take up their weapons of war against the Nephites. So I think they also recognize right here that they do not have time to take prisoners of war right now. They got to go. They got to get up to Nephihah, and they got to do it right away. And so their solution to this is all those who will promise not to make war against us again, which again has been the driving principle for Moroni. If they will promise not to come up to war against us again, then we'll spare them. And they're like, but we can't take care of them right now. So where should we send them? They send them to the people of Ammon. When they had entered into this covenant, they sent them to dwell with the people of Ammon. So that's another group. They've sent several of these people who are seeking peace or who need to be taught the ways of peace. They go to the people of Ammon.
Because that's the people who managed to change the Lamanites, because they are changed Lamanites.
They are the most Zion-like section of society here that they have. And it truly shows, because everyone that they send there is changed. They don't have dissenters stirring up problems there. They don't have ideologies of Nehor being propagated there. They don't have wars and contentions among themselves. Like, they are living in a very Zion-like society, so much so that everyone is truly welcome and then truly belongs there.
I think I said earlier that Nephihah was like the worst battle, and I realized that I was thinking about, I don't know what I was thinking about, but Nephihah is obviously not the worst battle because they managed to take it without losing a single soul.
Well, of the Nephites.
Of the Nephites. And the Lamanites flee, and I'm trying to remember, do they even fight when they're camped out? Because I know Tankum killing Amaron obviously is a parallel to the Malachiah story, but also to the way that Malachiah sees the kingship in the first place. And yes, they did slay them with a great slaughter and to drive them out of the land. So this is sort of this was what I was thinking of, this sort of last battle in the land of Moroni. But it's not even the last battle.
Well, and sorry to go back really quickly. So
go ahead. Sorry, I know I've been skipping around.
That's this whole section has been hard to take in one. But so Moroni and Pahoran come across this group in the middle on their way to Nephihah, right? And then they send them to live with the people of Ammon. And then they get to the city of Nephihah, and they are able to make the people there surrender to them without the loss of any Nephites. And then many of those Lamanites that were prisoners were desirous to join the people of Ammon and become a free people. And it came to pass that as many as were desirous, unto them it was granted according to their desires. Therefore all the prisoners of the Lamanites did join the people of Ammon, and did begin to labor exceedingly, tilling the ground, raising all manner of grain and flocks and herds of every kind. And thus were the Nephites relieved from a great burden, yea, insomuch that they were relieved from all the prisoners of the Lamanites. So it looks like by this point, all the prisoners of war that the Nephites have taken, they have either killed or have been sent to live with the people of Ammon. Is that accurate?
There was one group that was sent up to Bountiful, I believe, because they built a trench in the very beginning of this section. That's all I remember. Mm-hmm. But I think otherwise you're correct.
That's pretty much the fate of those two parts of that group.
Verse 41 is the one that I was thinking of. Many had become hardened because of the exceedingly great length of the war, and many were softened because of their afflictions, insomuch they did humble themselves before God, even in the depth of humility. The same environment. What's that quote? The same water that hardens an egg softens a carrot, something like that.
The end of this 31st year, the war is finally considered over. And there was once more peace established among the people of Nephi. And Moroni retires. And Moroni dies in the 36th year. Mm-hmm. And so he only gets 5 years of retirement.
Well, he's lived an exceptionally stressful life.
Well, Helaman dies in the 35th year of the reign of the judges of the people of Nephi. So that's only, depending on your interpretation, but only about 17 years after his father Alma leaves. So It sounds like either Alma's sons were older than I might think when he left them, or that Helaman dies rather young.
It's potential wounds from war.
Yeah, well, and that he passes the records to his brother Shiblon. He doesn't pass them immediately to his son Helaman, although Shiblon then passes them to Helaman in the 39th year. So Shiblon only keeps the record for about 4 years.
Yeah, it does remind me of Omni when we get the series of record keepers. And it kind of made me wonder if, because we have this story of Corianton going to the land northward, and that's after Shiblon died, and it makes me wonder, did we miss out on potentially a book of Corianton? Could you imagine?
Yeah.
Although Shiblon, obviously, even though he keeps record, he's not much of a writer. So
well, or at least we don't get anything in his first person, so we don't know how much Mormon abridged what he wrote. So
these groups who leave northward with Hagoth, he does the ship, but there's also these overland travels up north. So it seems like, there's sort of this mass exodus toward the north. And I wonder if some of these Nephites are like, well, we were surrounded by Lamanites, and that happened pretty quickly and led to a long time where we were stuck in Zarahemla and basically surrounded by war. So we're going to go to the north because it's got some sort of, narrow neck of land, narrow pass that would be extremely prohibitive for anyone to come wage a war through. So
maybe they wanted to go a little off the grid.
Possibly. That seems like a pretty reasonable response. I don't hold it against them, but it does. There's so many questions. Obviously, we have sort of a tradition in the church about, Hagoth being part of the Pacific Islanders.
Ancestry, yeah.
Ancestry. But there's other groups who don't go in the ships. Mm-hmm. So it makes you wonder, are there records, some of the ones that are prophesied to come forth as well? Who knows? Yeah. And then verse 14, we get another group of dissenters who go to the Lamanites and stir up people against the Nephites, and they have another war against people of Moronihah, and they lose, but it still is like, wow. So after that long period of war and the death of Moroni, it just happens again.
Yeah, just this is about 7 or 8 years after that big war. They get another round of dissenters going and stirring up the Lamanites, and ending the 39th year. So we've only 39 years has passed since the reign of Mosiah. And think about all that we've covered in that time. Alma is definitely the book that has the most chapters about the shortest period of time. We got a chapter for like 300 years in Omni and Words of Mormon, but then this is only 39 years here. So just think about the passage of close to 40 years from, there are people who have grown up and are fully adults in the society who don't know any different, but there is the older generation who remembers from before. Yeah, there are going to be plenty of people around who remember what life was like under Mosiah. That's going to be an interesting contrast as we're going through this. This is only the reign of the judges starts out rocky, but seems to handle it okay. And then once we get to Helaman here, it's just going to all break down. So
yeah, which, I kind of wonder if we get in 62 verse 47, regulations were made concerning the law and their judges, and the chief judges were chosen. Is this setting this next, is this setting the stage for this sort of next step in the Nephite tragedy? Because right after that, we get the people of Nephi begin to prosper again in the land. Now, right now, they're not lifted up in the pride of their eyes, but how long is that going to last?
Doesn't take long at all. So we've concluded the war chapters, and now we get to the political intrigue chapters next time. So,
which we still have some more ahead of us. So
exactly, they're related.
That's all for this week. Thank you to our editors for their hard work. Please make sure to rate and review the podcast on your podcast platform of choice, and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and tell your friends about our discussions. If you'd like to get involved, either through helping to edit, which we can train you on, you can reach out to us through the Facebook group, Latter-day Nonviolence, Pacifism, and Peace Studies, or through our website, latterdaypeacestudies.org/get-involved. We've got links in the show notes, and on that Get Involved page, you can also see how you can contribute regularly to help cover the cost of hosting. For Latter-day Peace Studies, I'm Dan.
And I'm Marianne.
We'll see you next week.